All right, I'm back. This is Awkward with the Awkward Interviews. I have an incredibly special guest here today, someone I've been trying to get a hold of for a long time. This is Victoria, better known as Vikki Law. She's an anarchist, an activist, a prison abolitionist, all like myself, a prolific writer and an editor, and someone who focuses on the intersection of women's rights, women's liberation, and mass incarceration. Not just the impact of mass incarceration on wives, mothers, and babies, but on the incarceration of women, the criminalization of certain women themselves, and telling the story of the lives of women who have been incarcerated. Among her books are Resistance Behind Bars, The Struggles of Incarcerated Women, as well as Prisons Make Us Safer and 20 Other Myths About Mass Incarceration. And the one that I just recently finished with my friend Maya Shenwar, Prisons by Any Other Name, The Harmful Consequences of Popular Reforms. In that book, Vikki and Maya say, among many other quotables, that reform is the refrain of the Koch brothers. As an abolitionist, it's one of the things that I explain a lot to people, that while reforms on the outside may, as well-intentioned as they may be, may look like a positive step in the right direction, but if they're not entirely decarceral, they often, as Angela Davis said, just work to strengthen the system itself. And Vikki and Maya went into really great detail about all the ways that, very touted reforms are just gentler genocide, or, using the same master's tools in different ways. So thank you so much for joining me. I've got a lot of questions for you about your background and how you ended up focusing on this stuff. And I think also importantly for my listeners, I'm going to assume I'm not an abolitionist, assume that I don't do interviews and answer these same questions. I see you as an expert, and I want to ask you the questions that I often get.
Sure.
Awesome. Okay, so first, let's start with your background. I know you do go into some detail about it in Prison by Any Other Name, but how did this become the focus of your work?
How did prisons, or how did
Both.
the terrible reforms that are posed?
Oh, not specifically reforms, because I think, that's one area that you've, kind of really done great work in, but in general, fighting oppression of certain peoples, the criminalization of certain peoples, focusing on women, focusing on mass incarceration.
Okay, so when I was in high school, I grew up in New York City. I grew up in Queens, one of the 5 boroughs of New York City, for listeners who are not that familiar with New York. When I was going to high school, there you went to the high school that you were zoned in. So if you lived in a certain neighborhood, you had to go to the neighborhood high school. But the neighborhood high schools were kind of cockamamie all over the place because of the way that school zoning worked. So the high school that I was zoned for was a high school that was mostly Black, brown, and immigrant. So even though I lived in a largely middle class neighborhood of many different races and people of many different immigration statuses, if you had a friend who lived in a better zone, you borrowed their address and you sent your child to that school. My mother did not know this until it was too late. And so I ended up going to a school which we now would call a school to prison pipeline school, meaning it's the kind of school where you put what we would call surplus populations, people who you deem as disposable or not that important to the functionings of American society and American capitalism. So in my high school, it was Black, brown, and immigrant students. It was students whose families did not have the resources to borrow an address to send them to a different school, could not afford to send them to private school. And basically, it was the perfect recruiting ground for gangs. It was an underfunded, under-resourced high school. We could not do outdoor sports because there were too many crack vials on the track, or the area that would be the track in the field. Um, and so instead of having a lot of extracurricular activities, which might motivate students to think about what they wanted to do with the rest of their lives, what we had instead were gang recruiters who would come in and say to many of the students there, how would you like to make a couple of $100 a night? And remember, in high school, for listeners who are perhaps well past high school age, when you're a teenager, you're not thinking long term. You're not thinking, what am I going to do in my 20s, 30s, and 40s? What you're thinking is, I see my mom struggling. She's working 2 jobs. It's really hard for her to, keep a roof over our head and feed us. And I'd really like to get those new sneakers. Oh, I'd really like to be able to take my girlfriend to the movies. Oh, I'd really like to fill in the blank, things that cost money. So many of my friends joined gangs, dropped out of high school, and then got arrested for gang-related activity. And in New York, even though we have a terribly funded public high school system or a public school system, we have an island devoted to jailing people who are deemed as disposable, called Rikers Island, which is, a little bit further away than my high school was, but it's also in Queens. And so my friends were not able to afford bail, and they were sent to Rikers Island to await their day in court. So they were held pre-trial. Interesting fact, Rikers Island is about 85% pre-trial people. So it is people who have not been deemed guilty of anything. They've been arrested and are sent there to sit and wait for their day in court. And I started going to visit my friends in Rikers Island. And at the same time, I started reading about prisons because I wanted to know what this new thing in my life was. And what I read and what I saw fit so perfectly. They just reinforced each other. When you go to visit somebody at Rikers Island, back in the days when you could visit people in person, you would sit in a waiting room. You'd actually sit in 2 waiting rooms. You'd sit in one waiting room and get called up to process, and then you'd sit in another waiting room after putting every single belonging that you owned in a locker. And then you would go upstairs and you would sit for hours on end. So what do you do? It's not like the doctor's waiting room or the dentist's waiting room where there's a TV or magazines. There's absolutely nothing. You just sit there. And so you start talking to the people around you. The people around me were mostly women, Black, brown, and immigrant women who are coming to visit their men folks, their husbands, their brothers, their boyfriends, their sons. And again, women would tell me, my man is here because he failed a drug test and he was on parole. My man is here because he was using drugs. My man was here because, and they were all criminalized actions that had to do with lack of opportunity. Nobody was there because they were Jeffrey Dahmer and they cut up a bunch of people and ate them. Nobody was there because they were Bernie Madoff and it swindled a bazillion people out of their retirement savings. Everybody was there because they were Black, brown, immigrant, and poor and lacked resources. And at the same time, that was what I was reading about in literature about prisons. And it got me to thinking, what is this system and why didn't I know about this? Nobody taught me about this in school, even though my school was one of the places that people were shooting into prison from. I was not seeing this in the larger news stories. But I didn't, think very much of it. It was something in the, constantly like playing in my head, sort of on the background. But I went on with my life. I graduated from high school, went to college. In college, I did a research paper on prison organizing post-1970s. What happens when COINTELPRO has decimated outside liberation movements and the war on drugs and the war on crime has really taken hold and the numbers of people in prison shoot up dramatically? What does organizing look like then? Why aren't we seeing hunger strikes and rebellions and hostage takeovers like we were in the 1970s? And at the end of the semester, I looked at everything I amassed and realized it was all men. Around that time, there were about 99,000 women behind bars. And I thought it was really strange that if there were 99,000 women behind bars, they were all sitting on their hands and passively accepting terrible medical care, violence and racism by guards, being subjected to solitary confinement. A couple of years earlier, some of my friends who had dropped out of high school and then gone to Rikers and then later were sentenced and plea bargains and sentenced and went to prison, got their GEDs, went on to start college programs. A couple of them got their associate's degrees until in 1994, Pell Grants were eliminated to people in prison, which meant that almost all of the nation's college and prison programs had been shuttered. And for my friends, strangely enough, prison was the place where they started to actually see meaning in education. Paradoxically and weirdly enough, I'm not saying that people should go to prison because they can somehow find meaning in education, but that is a glaring indictment of our outside society and the way that we educate Black, brown, and immigrant youth. So Pell Grants had been cut. Suddenly you don't have education. So what are 99,000 women all doing? So I was at Brooklyn College at the time. I was studying under Professor Jean Theo-Harris, who is now known for her civil rights scholarship. And she said to me, well, next semester, I want you to enroll in an independent study course with me, and I want you to look specifically at what the resistance and organizing in women's prisons look like. At the time, I was 8 months pregnant. I was not thinking that I wanted to take any other courses besides the required math and science courses to graduate college. I was definitely not thinking about doing more research on this topic. And she was actually very insistent. She said, I will do what I can to make this work for you. You don't have to come regularly to campus, which was an hour commute to meet me. You can bring your baby. We can meet at a location that is convenient to you. We don't have to meet every week. We can meet once a month. You can bring your baby. I will hold your baby while you tell me what your findings are. But what you cannot do is slack on the scholarship. That is the one requirement. And so I reluctantly agreed to do this. And what I learned was that if you think about prison issues, say as this gigantic bookshelf behind me, and it's supposedly all gender neutral, at least at the time, all the books are gender neutral and they assume that men and women have the same issues, everything is focused on the male experience because women only made up about 10% of the prison population. But if you look at the framing from what women are experiencing in prison, it's a very small section all the way at the bottom, covered in cobwebs and dust that nobody pays attention to. Because while they experience all of the same injustices as men do, there are also very gendered experiences of incarceration. For instance, the majority of people in prisons are parents, but because women tend to be the primary caregivers, oftentimes when a mother goes to prison, her children are less likely to be able to keep in touch. They're 5 times more likely to end up in foster care. They're more likely to lose custody. So it's a higher priority for women in prison, if they have children, to maintain contact with their children and fight for custody of their children than it is for men who might say, okay, my ex-wife is taking care of them, or my ex-girlfriend, I may not see them as much, but I know where they are. I know that they're safe. I know that they're fed. I know that they're clothed. And I know when I get out of prison, I will know where they are so I can work to rebuild that relationship. If you think about medical care, everybody experiences terrible medical care in prison. I'm not saying that men are having a superb time of medical care, but if you think about gender-specific medical care, women were not getting that. So women were organizing in different ways and resisting. And that's what I found out, is that women would be in the law libraries, helping each other with family court law. And then they would start saying, wait, why don't we first try to get lawyers to come in to do know your rights workshops? Why don't we try to advocate for social workers to actually bring our children to come visit us if they are in foster care? Why don't we try to push for laws that don't force judges to terminate our parental rights simply because we are in prison? So from there, this kind of organizing grew. But again, if you're not looking at parenting as a prison issue, you're not looking at what women are doing to resist and organize as resistance and organizing. So from there, I started writing about these issues because I thought, well, these stories need to be told, and I wasn't seeing them. And what I wanted to do was not only share these stories and these experiences, but also share what the women themselves were doing. So a lot of my reporting continues to this day to be about what people who are directly impacted by these systems are doing. So throughout Prison by Any Other Name, we talk about harmful consequences of reform, and we don't just talk about it as poor Elliot was hospitalized several times during his youth and during his young adulthood and experienced all of these traumatizing experiences that are very similar to the prison experience. And then we're going to go interview this other person that's an academic that has never experienced these systems to see what they're doing about it or to see what they say about it. But we're actually looking at people with lived experiences to say, okay, this was a terrible experience, but now here's what they're doing about it as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think you're the so-called academic. You don't need to be reinforced by additional academics.
Mhm.
And I also try to center the most impacted, those who are formerly incarcerated or currently incarcerated. And that's something that I think is critically important, not just in education, but in liberation movements, and in the reentry services too. As many who are formerly incarcerated themselves and are now trying to do that work have told me, a lot, the very limited resources that are available to men or women coming out of prison are often under the control of a nonprofit that is predominantly white led and um, you know philanthropically dictated through the nonprofit industrial complex. So in addition to certain people being targeted in this society, the kind of the say in how things are changed, or how people's lives are improved, are also not under the control of the people who know it the best.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So I guess I will, move on to just in general, the myths about prisons, among them being that prisons keep us safer. What do you think are the greatest misconceptions about our criminal injustice society? And what are the realities of these myths that are so often kind of regurgitated by the media that you mentioned, not telling the true stories, but actually perpetuating mass incarceration through focusing on fear and certain types of crimes that are less common?
Yes. I mean, you've hit the nail on the head. It's that we think of prisons, and media and myths about mass incarceration focus on people's fears. People want to be safe. Nobody wants to live in a society where you don't feel safe walking down the street, or you don't feel safe in your home, or you don't feel safe anywhere. So mass incarceration feeds off of those myths about safety and violence. And what we think about when we think about prisons, and what we've seen during the ongoing COVID pandemic, is that when states or local jurisdictions talk about releasing people from jails and prisons, often there are questions about safety. And often there are questions in the media about people being released. Who is going to be released? Will this make us less safe? Will crime go up because people are not being caged in jails or in prisons? Rather than asking, what are the things that make our society safe? So people again and again fall into this myth that prisons make us safer because they lock away people who would do harm or violence to other people. Not realizing that prisons are, so if harm and violence happens, prisons come after that. Prisons don't prevent prisons do not prevent the vast majority of people from harming others or inflicting violence upon others. For your viewers and your listeners, if they think about their past week, how many people have they consciously decided not to murder or maim or rape or kill or, inflict bodily harm on because they were afraid of going to prison, rather than saying, I was really mad because that person cut me off in traffic or cut me off online or wasn't wearing a mask and got too close to me at the supermarket. But I didn't turn around and stab them or shoot them or punch them in the face because I was afraid of prison. It's just not actually something I would have done. Prison is not the deterrent to me inflicting violence upon somebody because of this. So prisons are not the deterrent for the vast, vast majority of people. And then also when we think about the way that the criminal legal system works, it often doesn't, it not only doesn't stop violence and harm, but it also doesn't solve or address it or even provide any sort of closure for people who have experienced violence. Last year in Georgia, for instance, there were 2,684 reported rapes. So this is just people who had been sexually assaulted who chose to go to the police. And we know that people who are sexually assaulted vastly choose not to go to the police. So this is a fraction of actual sexual assaults that happened. And of those 2,684 people that went to the police and reported this, there were only 349 arrests made. That meant that the police chose not to investigate or didn't find enough evidence or, just chose not to arrest the vast majority of people who might or might not have sexually assaulted somebody. So for over 2,000 people, that just left them with this lingering question of, why did I bother going to report this? Why did I open myself up to interrogation, often by several different people at several different times, as to this traumatic thing that happened, and it did not provide any safety or any closure for me. So when we think about these kinds of harms that happen, we can see that arrests aren't necessarily made, prosecutions aren't made, imprisonment does not happen. And when it does, it doesn't, again, keep people safe, and it doesn't provide closure. It might allow a person to say, okay, this person is away from me, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that person is now safe. You don't get a special bubble that says, I managed to lock away the person who harmed me. Now nobody else in this world will harm me, as opposed to looking at the conditions that cause this kind of harm to continue and in some cases be encouraged as well.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I feel like a big part of it is just this notion of revenge in this country, because it's really obvious that imprisoning one person doesn't prevent a different person from doing the same thing to you. So if you're not addressing the underlying causes, unless you knew the person and they were your like abuser, you're not safer. And so, I think that there's, I wonder if there's something about, in addition to the long history of, why police were created in this country and why prisons were created and who is being criminalized and incarcerated versus, the population of people who may have broken the law. I just wonder, and I never really think about this or talk about this, but like, what part of it is like our ingrained, like almost like soul of this nation to be so punitive?
I think, again, we have an addiction to punishment. I mean, we equate being safe with punishing people who have done wrong. And then in the United States, as in many countries, that punishment is very racialized. So the United States has a disproportionately surveils, polices, and imprisons Black and brown people. But the same thing happens in places like Australia and the UK and places that have non-homogeneous populations. And I think, again, it plays into racialized fear-mongering. When we think about, you mentioned the history of the police, the modern day police force emerged from slave catchers. They did not, they did not emerge from this ability to keep people safe. They emerged from white people who were tasked with tracking down fugitive slaves. Black people who had run away from bondage and capture to be able to seek freedom. So if we look at the roots of that, and then we look at what we have in the present day, where police disproportionately surveil, arrest, brutalize, and kill Black people and other people of color, we can say, oh, we can see this historical trajectory. Police were not uh, created to go around to all sorts of different homes and say, we just wanted to make sure you had enough to eat. Oh, you don't? Oh, you haven't had fresh fruit in a week? Let me go to the food supply warehouse and bring you back some apples, oranges, and pears. Like this was not why the police were created, to be able to address societal problems. But it's the thing that we keep falling back on when we talk about safety, when we talk about all sorts of societal problems. If we think about, Angela Davis calls prisons the black hole in which we sweep society's people who are deemed to be society's detritus into. We think of police as, one of the ways in which people get swept into these black holes. And
Yeah.
one other thing I want to add is that, there's been also less attention being paid to like the pushback against police as, the safety notions. I mean, if we see across the United States, there are rises in anti-Asian violence. As somebody who is Asian, this affects me. Now that I think about, what happens if I go to take out my garbage and some racist idiot decides to try to set me on fire, as has happened in Brooklyn, where a woman tried to take out her garbage. There was a man sitting on her stoop. She didn't think anything of it. He threw some sort of lighter fluid on her and tried to set her on fire. Now, policing did not prevent this man from doing this. What we need to do is look at the root causes of what is happening, that there is a rise in anti-Asian violence. What is happening that people are equating this forever lockdown and this forever pandemic with Asians and Asian Americans and causing violence towards them? And then how do we combat that? So in, I believe it was Oakland, people involved with Black Lives Matter started escorting Asian people from the subways or from mass transit to their homes so that they would be less likely to be attacked. So it's also, how do we keep each other safe? Not just, well, sorry, Asian people, that you're being targeted for violence. Don't demand that there be more policing, but good luck with that, goodbye. So it's also questions of how do we keep each other safe, and then how do we change these conditions? So, for people who are not Asian, it might be speaking out when you hear people say something about the China virus, or, oh, that Asian so-and-so is, might have the coronavirus, I don't like Asian people, or, like combating those kinds of notions when you find them.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really glad you brought that up, because I think that I've heard this for forever from different people, like whether it's the death penalty and being, wanting to, abolish the death penalty, or being an abolitionist in general, like wanting, supporting the movement to abolish police and prisons and replace them with more humanist systems. It like seems to work for some people until they hit a point where it's going to impact, they think it's going to impact them directly. So yes, I don't like, I see that police are killing 3 people every day, and are only, targeting certain communities that they don't live in. I see that, prisons, are the extension of that. And, we incarcerate, predominantly nonviolent offenders, drug offenders. And I don't think that it keeps us safer. But now I may be a target of racist violence. Who's going to help me? That's what cops do. And if someone does that to my grandma, I want them to be penalized. That's what prisons do.
Mhm.
And now you're up against this like dilemma where intellectually, up until it was, in your, like, directly affecting you, you supported this concept, and then all of a sudden it doesn't fit anymore. And that's because I feel like we as a society, it's been so ingrained in us, the concepts of, of criminal and victim, of crime and punishment. And that there's no other alternatives we could seek, that it wasn't created, but this system wasn't created by people too. So I'm really glad to hear you say that, even as someone, and it doesn't surprise me, obviously, because, I know you have thought through this for many years, but you're an example of someone who rightfully would be in greater fear today than prior to COVID because of the increased violence against Asian people, and understand still that unless there was a cop in front of every stoop, they wouldn't be there. They wouldn't be able to prevent all of these random racist attacks. And, stopping the next one, you can't stop the next one by calling the police and arresting the guy who did it the time before. So, that really leads me to my next kind of questions, where I'm wondering if you can kind of answer the questions that I always try to answer, that we get all the time. So, and you gave one example, members of the Black community walking members of the Asian community to and from where they needed to go. It reminds me of white allies standing in front of Black activists at protests, particularly like white women, because they're less likely to be attacked by the cops at protests. It's that sounds a little, I don't see these examples as being, mechanisms that could be like done on a mass scale, though. So, for one thing, the first question is, how do we keep us safer if we don't have police, and we don't have prisons? What do you envision as being there in place to keep us safer? Assuming, that they make us safe in the first place. Because I know that's part of the answer is they don't, but what would keep us safer?
Well, I think first we need to not think about, if we take out this giant 2.2 million puzzle piece, this 2.2 million people cage, that we need to be able to put another giant piece in. So it's not a one-for-one substitution. But what would keep us safer, sort of in the more abstract, and then I'll go down to the more concrete, is investing in people and communities. So many of the people who are in prison are people from communities and neighborhoods and families and populations that have continually been under-resourced and, to use capitalist terms, underinvested in. So if you look at, say, in New York, people in New York State prisons tend to come from the places that are have the least number of resources, have the least amount of tax dollars put in, have terrible high schools like the one I just described going to in the 1990s, don't have other opportunities and options. And when there are fewer opportunities and options, people turn to criminalized activity. So A, there's that. B, there's what are we criminalizing and why are we putting people in prison? So in Prison by Any Other Name, Maya and I asked people, well, what would have helped instead? And for some people, the answer was nothing. Just do nothing. Why are we having one of the alternatives to incarceration that is posed as a reform are sex worker rescue programs, in which police and well-meaning social workers that hate sex work drive around and they sweep up people that they believe are engaged in sex work. In Phoenix, Arizona, this tended to be women of color and trans women of color. So you were, on the street corner, maybe you were doing sex work, maybe you were just on your way to the bar to like go take advantage of happy hour on a Friday night. And they said, whoa, trans woman of color wearing booty shorts, must be a sex worker, dragged to a church, not the precinct, but a church, and told, you can either participate in this alternative diversion program to a sex work arrest, or we can take you to the precinct and book you. And in Arizona, the penalties for sex work were 30 days for a first offense, 60 days for a second offense, 90 days for a third offense, and a fourth conviction pushes you from a misdemeanor to a felony. So women were like, oh, wait, what? I might get 30 days in jail, or I can go to this program. Great, I'll go to this program, which then took up a lot of time during the work week, which you had to go to and from. You had to fulfill all these mandates. And for what? So when we interviewed Monica Jones, who was entrapped and arrested and by police under one of these sex worker rescue programs, and then became an outspoken advocate against these programs, she said, leave people alone. If they're not harming people, leave people alone. We see this now as various states are beginning to decriminalize marijuana. They're not hurting anybody. Leave people alone. So one, we need to think like, we could shrink that puzzle piece dramatically if we operate under this premise of not everything needs to be criminalized. Not everything needs to be a criminal action. Dr. Carl Hart, a neuroscientist, just came out with a book called Drug Use for Grown-Ups, in which he posits that, there are tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people across the United States who use drugs and are not addicted to them. So don't criminalize them. Don't force them to go to prison. Don't force them to go to rehab. They are actually just using substances the same way that, I drink coffee every morning. Somebody else might, drink wine every night. Coffee and wine are not criminalized substances. If somebody is able to do other substances and is not hurting anybody, leave them alone. So let us shrink that, and then let us use these, and then let us put more resources and opportunities again into communities, so that way there is affordable and accessible housing for everybody. So people who are in abusive or controlling relationships can leave, because the number one barrier to domestic violence victims saying that they cannot leave is that they say, I don't have a place to go. I can maybe go to a shelter for 30 days. Or we interviewed one woman who had 4 children, and the shelter could only take her and 2 children. So what are you supposed to do? You can't say, well, which 2 children did I not really like so much? Like, which 2 are my favorite and which 2 will I leave with my abusive husband? God. So she chose to stay put. So affordable and accessible housing, we could build that if we actually prioritize people's well-being over this notion that somehow policing in prisons will decrease violence and keep us safe. So going from that, and then also just addressing these root causes. Again, what is causing this spike in anti-Asian violence? We can trace this back to, ex-President Donald Trump calling it the China virus, the Wuhan virus, the China coronavirus, blaming Asian reporters at press conferences for the coronavirus, and then this spike in anti-Asian violence. So how do we address that? Obviously, even if he went and took those words back now, it would not make much difference. But people in communities, particularly people in communities that are not impacted directly, can say, hey, that's racist. Hey, it actually, we don't actually call it that, or we don't blame every Asian person for the coronavirus. We don't do this, that, or the other. And finding ways to safely intervene as well. So I think also it is, in some ways, part of our community. So we don't scale it up so that there's like a nationwide, everybody walks every Asian person home from the subway, but we say, what are the needs in our community and how do we address that? And then in our circles, how do we challenge some of the harmful thoughts and behaviors, which even if people in your circle are never going to, get up and go set somebody on fire, hopefully, you could say like, hey, that's racist. And have you thought about how this contributes to this wider lack of safety for other people?
Right. So that's something that is probably difficult for many to even wrap their heads around, focusing, because it seems like something that we so rarely do as like within the capitalist system is focus smaller, focusing on our communities. We work from the top down. And I definitely think that's a huge part of it, is taking care of ourselves. So we hold each other accountable as human beings, as opposed to having some higher authority hold us responsible to like what they deem to be the rules and everything like that. So what do you say then to to people who say what do we do with the rapists, the murderers, the pedophiles who are committing crimes, not out of desperation due to poverty? They're bad people. How do we prevent that? How do we treat them if there's no prisons for them to be taken to?
Well, in the words of prison abolitionist Mariam Kaba, the prison system is not addressing them now. I mean, I just told you about the statistics for arrests for rape, and that 349 out of 2,684 people who are arrested, those numbers go down when you think about, of those 349 people, who gets prosecuted. It's a smaller number. Who is actually convicted? It's a smaller number. Who actually gets sentenced to prison versus some probation or something else? It's an even smaller number. And then, are they actually getting any sort of counseling or re-education or anything while they are in prison? No, they are not. I mean, we see this example with Bill Cosby, right? So, not to give you like the scary person who jumps out of the bushes, but America's favorite dad, who is in prison for drugging and sexually assaulting women, and so many women came out against him.
Yeah.
And he was finally arrested. This was like something people knew for years and years and years. Went to prison, and is he thinking about, gee, it was wrong to use my position as America's favorite dad and somebody with a lot of clout in the media world to do this to women repeatedly, many, many women over the years? No, he is filing legal appeals that are arguing that statute of limitations had run out, or this, that, or the other. He's not saying, maybe after what I did to this woman, here are the ripple effects and the repercussions. So, and Bill Cosby, unless he dies of old age or COVID, will get out of prison at some point, and maybe more women will not go and have a drink with him ever again, but it doesn't solve that problem. It is not convinced every single young Black man or young man of any color who looked up to Bill Cosby during their youth to say, gee, I should treat women better, and I should always make sure I have explicit consent, and I never do anything like that. This is not, his imprisonment has not shifted our mindset around
Right.
assault.
So what would?
I think what would is, education, consent, and again, also asking victims and survivors, what do you need? Understanding that people who commit violence have had violence committed to them on them before. So breaking those cycles of violence. Again, I mean, boys and men are conditioned to not talk about the violence that they have endured. They're conditioned to not go and seek help to try to break cycles. So, having these kinds of conversations, from when men and boys are very young, all the way through adulthood. So you don't say like, oh, you're 22, you should know all this now. But, to say like, hey, that wasn't a cool joke. Or, like, hey, I don't like the way that you just talked to your girlfriend. Those kinds of things. And then there have been numerous examples of informal groups where men band together when sexual assaults are happening in a community. In Brooklyn, several years ago now, there was a range of a spate of sexual assaults that happened, and a group of young men got together and said, you know what, we're going to do what Black Lives Matter is now doing with Asian people in Oakland, is we're going to hang out at the subway stations and offer to walk women home, and then that way, we're providing this concrete service where women can go, like get off the train when they're coming home from work or they're coming home from hanging out with their friends, and there's somebody that can escort them home, and they can be safe. And at the same time, they were trying to raise awareness about the fact that men had to do something about sexual assault too. This could not just be women's problems. So I think seeing efforts like that, but we don't see that as posited in larger conversations as how do we make people safe? How do we prevent sexual assault? Well, we don't continue to ignore the conditions that cause this. There's no light on that block. That block is really dark. That block is a perfect place for somebody to attack somebody else. But people need to walk past that block, or they live on that block, to be able to get home.
Right.
How do we continue to create these conditions that challenge safety and danger, while also saying, we can't rely on police to be doing this.
Right. Unlike the police who are armed and have, essentially like extrajudicial powers, the men who volunteered to walk women home are regular people with good intentions who are simply doing that. There's no way they could arrest them. There's no way that if they did, God forbid, do something terrible to them, they would be able to do it with impunity, due to immunity through the law. So it sounds, not like community policing, which also doesn't work, but a non-policing framework of communities protecting themselves and I think another key point that you brought up was asking victims and acknowledging that perpetrators have often been victims themselves. So learning what actually needs to be done based on what the actual issues are, as opposed to what the fears may be. What about first responders? I have two more questions. So again, there's this misconception from propaganda that cops, come rushing in and solve the problem. We know, of course, that they don't come until after, and the latest study shows that they only solve about 2% of all major crimes after they've happened. But that's something I'm asked all the time, is if there are no cops, who responds when you call for help? What do you envision as being like the force of nonviolent people that would actually help, depending, irrespective of what, unless it was a fire, obviously, then a firefighter comes, but like to other emergencies, what does that response team look like?
Well, it depends on, again, what the situation is. But I mean, we see in Eugene, Oregon, there's been this program that's run for 27, maybe 29 by now years, called CAHOOTS. I don't remember what
Yep.
that acronym stands for, but it's community assistance something, where basically if somebody's having a mental health problem or a mental health crisis, instead of the police responding, trained mental health workers do so. And so they are trained in intervention, because police are trained to control a situation. You subdue a person and you control the situation, and you often subdue them by force. You're not sitting there trying to figure out, like, you are in mental health crisis, you may want to hurt yourself or hurt others or a combination. Let's talk. Let's figure this out. In Atlanta, there's a similar program. I forget what the name is, but there's a similar program which has been chronically underfunded. But people who do diversion work for people who are facing arrest or people who are diverted from arrest into a program have said they've used this in their personal lives. They've used this for clients, but it's stretched thin. So there's only a limited number of calls that they can take, because if you only have a staff of X and the number of calls you get is X times 20, there are a whole bunch of calls you're not going to be able to take and to deal with. So looking at what kinds of responses are other people doing to 911, because people who call 911 say when their loved one is in crisis are not doing this because they want the police to come and tase and brutalize and kill their loved one. They're doing this because they are frightened and they are desperate. And we have all been taught from the time that we can figure out what numbers look like, if something bad happens, you call 911. People with small children back in the time of landlines probably remember at some point their small child called 911 because that was what they heard on TV or saw in school. And then the parents were roundly chastised for, having their kids do this. So we have all been taught, because I think I did this as a little kid and my parents were really not happy. It's like, oh, this is what I taught. This is what I learned in school today. So it's unlearning that and then figuring out, like, what are the things that will keep us safe? If somebody's in a mental health crisis, how do we address this? Is there an alternatives, like in the CAHOOTS program or in Atlanta or in San Francisco or someplace else, that we can call on? And how do we advocate that these organizations that are not punitive, that are not violent, that are designed to help address and resolve issues, or at least stabilize a situation, get more funding, so that way they don't have to choose between call 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So
Yeah.
we can talk about looking at those, and then how do we also equip ourselves to deal with this if we live in a place where there aren't these kinds of programs even available, let alone robustly funded. Because I think one of the problems with calling police and relying on prisons is it also takes away the agency and the responsibility and the accountability from everybody around them. So I don't have to address, what this person is doing, because all I have to do is pick up the phone and call 911. I don't have
Right.
to say, how do we as a community address this, that, or the other?
Yeah. So, so one, how do we come up with this money? What do you think the first step is in funding these alternatives that have some history in being effective, and in communities where these programs don't exist, and we're talking about kind of building it ourselves and relying on alternatives? It seems like even someone who is against the police being the responder, because they know that they typically don't de-escalate and they make the situation more violent, and when they're in that community that doesn't have an alternative, it's kind of like, well, have to call the police, because there's, as much as I don't want to, as much as I wish there was an alternative, this is all there is now. So what would be your advice? So on the one hand, how do we fund these alternatives, and then on the road to funding them, developing them, and replacing police, like, what would be your advice to someone who is in a situation and doesn't know what to do because they don't want to call the police but don't know of an alternative?
So one, we saw this last summer in several cities. We could shift funding from police budgets, which are gigantic, and police get funding for things like being the first responders to mental health calls. They should not be. Police departments across the country have even admitted that they don't want to deal with mental health calls. They don't want to deal with this kind of call or that kind of call. So you could take that giant chunk of funding, because police departments get billions and billions of dollars, and put this into these programs. Because even if you say, well, we don't know if they really work, like this hasn't really been, like we haven't had enough studies that show that this kind of program works. What we see is that having police be the first responders is not working. So we can't say like, oh, they're doing this like 99% great job, and now we're going to put it into this program, which we don't know about. We know that they are doing a terrible job at responding to mental health crises calls. We know that they're doing a terrible job at responding to domestic violence calls. So really what we're saying is, let's shift that money, because you have done a terrible job at this. Also, your budgets are bloated already, and every other agency has gotten several haircuts during this pandemic. Let us take this money and put it into something else, where there are people who are trained in responding to mental health crises. There are people who are trained in helping domestic violence victims and survivors navigate what they need. There are people who are trained to, deal with survivors of child sexual abuse. We can start shifting that money, instead of saying like, let's just keep putting more money into policing. Now we're going to have mental health policing
Yeah.
units. Now we're going to have domestic violence policing units. And now we're going to have, this type of unit and that type of unit, and putting more money into a failed approach, an approach we know has already failed. We can shift that money away. We've seen this in different cities across the country, especially in the lives of the defund the police movements that were happening last summer. And for people who are in places where there aren't these kinds of programs, it's like, maybe start, asking, other folks, like, we can't solve problems by ourselves, but we can see like who else has this kind of expertise, who might be willing to start trying to figure out like, what do we need to do? Start small and scale up. And then if you are in a situation where you do have no choice but to call 911, several years ago, my friend was living in a building where one of his neighbors had a roommate, maybe it was an ex-partner, who was in mental health crisis. And when he was in mental health crisis, sometimes he got violent. And at one point, his neighbor asked, can you call the police? But he was really worried, because his roommate or ex-partner was a Black man, was going through a mental health crisis, was very loud. And so my friend called the police. He was a white person. He met the police on the ground floor of this walk-up building, continually said, he's having a mental health crisis, but he is not dangerous. He is not armed. He's not dangerous. He's not armed. He's not dangerous. He's not armed. Escorted them up. Not dangerous, not armed. Please don't put your hands on your guns. We have children in the building. Not dangerous, not armed. Not dangerous, not armed. Continue to do that. It is not a silver bullet. It does not mean that the police will not, turn around and shoot somebody. But he did, the harm reduction that he could. And the police, and I think it was also EMT showed up. I was not there. So this is why I'm a little fuzzy as to what the details were. Realized this man was in extreme mental health crisis, brought him back down to an ambulance finally. But the man was not shot. The man was not beat up. The man was not tased. He was not brutalized. They did not throw him down the stairs. He was brought to the hospital, and they did whatever they did there to stabilize him enough so that he could come back 3 days later. He was no longer ranting and raving and threatening violence and could continue on with his life. So sometimes it might be, how do we do drastic amounts of harm reduction, which is not you just call 911 and then you hang up the phone and you go back to watching TV. You become an active participant. Maybe you get 5 of your neighbors to come and also be active participants in this. Not dangerous, not dangerous. What we really need is the ambulance. We really actually don't really need the police to be here. What we need is the EMT workers to come and bring them to the hospital. But, if you're going to insist on having the police come, then we're going to do our best to make sure that this does not end up tragically for this person.
That's a great answer, because that whole story was terrifying, just like envisioning, like I see this all the time, and I knew that yours was going to come out positive by the way you framed it. And it was still terrifying because I'm like, there's nothing you can do to stop it. But they did, they prevented it from turning violent. And I think it's a really great suggestion, having certain people kind of just push the harm reductionist methods as much as possible to kind of serve as a barrier almost, or a layer of protection. So what happens in a situation like that where, someone is in a mental health crisis and we are in an abolitionist framework, post prisons, and there are mental health and substance abuse treatment mechanisms in place, but someone is in a situation psychologically where they can't just be treated outpatient by choice and make it to their appointments. And again, there's no punitive measures for missing appointments, but even like the ability to get to those appointments and to keep the schedule, is there a form of the mental institution that isn't carceral, that isn't sending us back to before we emptied out those terrible places where people can get treatment, and like, is there a way to insist that they get that treatment without it being carceral, even if the nature of the place itself is not about control and power and surveillance and dehumanization?
I mean, I think that we have and we haven't those places. So there are community health centers, including community mental health centers, that, again, like many other non-police, non-prison resources, are grossly underfunded. I mean, under Chicago Mayor Rahm Emanuel, I think half of Chicago's community health centers were closed. So these were places where people could go, develop a rapport with their doctor, whether it be a medical doctor or a mental health counselor or a therapist or a psychiatrist or a psychologist. But it was in the neighborhood. You could go there. You weren't in some big institutional building. You were going to, the clinic that was like in the next neighborhood over, or, like 5 blocks from your house. You saw the same person over and over. For mental health especially, you want to develop a rapport. You don't want to be seeing a different person every time who's just like checking you off on off a checklist, giving you a bunch of medications and then sending you home. And then the next time you see somebody totally different who asks you all the same questions, doesn't know anything about your history, doesn't have the time or the wherewithal to do follow-up because they've got a whole bunch of people on their list. So having more community health centers and community mental health centers. So both are very important. Also, understanding that, and I am not an expert in, mental health treatment or helping people through mental health crises. Understanding that sometimes it's not a linear thing where it's like, oh, you're going to get better. It's like you might get better, and then you might decide, I'm better. I don't need my meds, or I don't need to go to therapy, and then sliding down. But having also a support network to help you. So in our book, when we interviewed people about alternatives to involuntary psychiatric confinement and forced mental health treatment, they said that they built networks, and this took a while, and it's not a one size fits all. So, what does your community crisis team look like? Like if you are in crisis, if somebody can develop this plan before they go into crisis, because plans made in crisis are not that great. But if you can say, like, I'm stable now and I don't want to go to the hospital if I become less stable. What are the things, who are the people I can reach out to? Who are the people who are willing to be part of my support? And do they know what I want and what I don't want, what is helpful and what is not helpful? Mia Mingus from the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective does this thing that she calls pod mapping, where basically, like, it's kind of like, those like flow charts where you have like a circle in the middle, which is the person. The first set of circles around them is, like their immediate support people. The next set of people might be people who are like, I can come and like, I can drive you to the health center. I have a car. I can drive you Mondays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. This person can drive you Saturdays and Sundays. This person, can only drive you on Friday afternoons. But if you have a Friday afternoon appointment, bingo. But don't call them at 3 a.m. when you're in crisis, because they cannot help you then for other, for whatever reasons, and then there's like maybe another circle who are like people who are like, hey, haven't heard from you in a while, just checking in and making sure you're okay and not isolated with your own thoughts, especially during a pandemic. So developing that network of support. So the first circle of people, are the people that you might reach out to when you're like, hey, I think I'm sliding downhill. And they have had conversations with you. So they're not trying to figure this out on the fly. They're like, what do you need when you feel this? What do you need when you feel that? Maybe it's like, oh, wait, you just need to not be alone right now, but I'm dealing with my mom, who is sick, or, like I'm quarantining because I've been exposed to COVID, or I have COVID. But I can text somebody in one of those outer circles to say, hey, can anybody go and hang out with Vikki for like 2 hours, because she needs to not be alone right now. Can somebody just go watch a movie with her? Like go to her house, order some takeout, watch a movie. Like, how do we do this? Or it might be like, hey, can somebody take her to the hospital right now? She's not doing too well. So having these kinds of support systems, which people can do even if there's not a formal program in their community. So it might be something that is less daunting to say, I know somebody, or I am somebody who might need this kind of support. How do I build this from my social network?
Right. So it seems like one common thread that's flowing through all of this is that it's not just it really requires a restructuring of our our society, our communities, and our own minds. That the way that this can work is from the ground up, focusing on your circles, your inner and then outer circles of your communities, and being human, and humans caring for other humans, which is beautiful, and it's possible, but it is also counter to like the Protestant ethic, the capitalist system. And you pointed out, and I always like am really careful how I phrase what something that you said earlier, because you mentioned that, I think in regard to policing and I guess probably prisons too, like it's not working. And it isn't. It is not working to keep us safer. It is not working for Black and brown people. It is not working for immigrants, not working for poor people. But on the other hand, it is working exactly as intended. It's doing what they set out to have it do when they created this. And and then when you talk about the prison industrial complex and the profit motive, the connection between police unions and police foundations and politicians and the corporations, in private prisons as well as state and federal prisons, and for-profit policing, forfeit asset, asset forfeiture and ticketing. And how, is there a way to be an abolitionist and not be anti-capitalist? Is there a way to I have my answer to this. I'm curious what you think. Is there a way to achieve a lot of these abolitionist goals without overthrowing capitalism?
I would say no, because capitalism is built on this idea that you have some people who have, you have lots of people who have not, and then you have some people who are just disposable. I mean, what we have in our nation's jails and prisons is a population who are largely deemed disposable. And then we have built our criminal legal system around this idea of putting these disposable people someplace. People who engage in sex work, people who engage in, selling bootleg DVDs or whatever, people who engage in whatever movie
street economy, yeah.
Street economy things, people who engage in dealing illicit substances, but we're not putting the Sackler family in prison. And, so it's very much like, it's not the amount of harm that a street heroin or street meth dealer does in terms of the amount of harm in the community that, that might have caused is a tiny little droplet compared to the harm that the Sackler family has done. So we shift surplus populations out of sight, out of mind. These are people that have been deemed surplus from the very beginning, especially, during the beginning of this nation. And then as we went on and we eliminated legal chattel slavery, we shifted that surplus population into other forms of coercive control. And we can say the same thing, and it just expanded. So it started with certain populations and then it expanded. So occasionally a middle-class white person gets caught up in this and they say, you know what, why me? This whole new Jim Crow does not apply to me. I am not Black, I am not poor, I've not come from a historically marginalized and oppressed population, but the system keeps expanding itself and it just keeps reaching out and entangling more and more people in it. And instead of saying how do we create, and capitalism relies on these divides. So capitalism doesn't want me and you to be sharing, this giant bag of Doritos. They want us both to go buy, our own individual bag of Doritos and eat them separately in our separate houses that we pay for separately, drinking, our beverage of choice, which we also paid for separately. They don't want people to say, how do we come together and build these things and make sure everybody's needs are taken care of?
Right. It's totally the antithesis of this community building framework. But I don't want to say that. So I don't answer it that way. I say absolutely not. Because, they can profit somewhere else. Why do they have to profit off of 8 cents an hour new slaves in prisons? Because to me, if we say that there's no way to, overthrow the policing and prison system without overthrowing capitalism, do we have any shot? Isn't that I have a hard enough time convincing people of the feasibility of abolition and the ways that that would keep us safer. If I'm saying we also need to take down capitalism, my supporters are dwindling even greater. And I say that knowing that people like me who are pushing for the things that are considered the most extreme are important just for shifting the conversation. And it's people, certainly people far greater than me, but people like me who are abolitionists, who are the reason that small defunding successes are occurring. To me, that's starting the ball rolling. And if it's decarceral, it's a great step in the right direction. But like, how do we rightfully push for this and expect support if that's important, if it's like, if it entails something so much greater beyond just this criminal system?
I think we need to not think of it as something we need to do all at once,
Yeah.
because obviously we did not build racial capitalism was not built in one day, 1 year, 1 decade. Neither was this giant system of mass incarceration. It was built over time. So it's like, how do we start dismantling it? And then, to quote Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who is a prison abolitionist, the director of CUNY's Place, Space, and Something or Another, but also like a brilliant carceral geographer, in which she looks at how the carceral state, how prisons have changed the geography, of our country. She talks about what we non-reformist reforms, or what are the reforms, to use that word, that are going to start dismantling the prison system, brick by brick, fence by fence, bar by bar, but are not taking these same things and putting them elsewhere. So when we talk about releasing people onto electronic monitors or ankle shackles and placing them under the same sort of coercive monitoring and surveillance and threat of punishment as prisons, that's a reformist reform, where we take those bars and those bricks and then we build something else over here and it's nicer. Versus, how do we get people out and allow them to live safe, happy, productive lives? How do we do that? And by productive, I don't mean the capitalist system of you go to work and you work 10 hours a day for Amazon, but things that are meaningful lives, I should say. Like, how do we do this so that way you say, like, I find meaning in the fact that, like, I am able to, like, have a family or be with my family, and I'm able to do this, and and these other things that I am doing, as opposed to saying, like, yeah, I'm out of prison, but I'm just working this crappy job at the Amazon warehouse, and I risk getting COVID, and I have to work 25 hours a day to be able to make my rent. So like, how do we? So we need to be thinking about non-reformist reforms. And if people are not at this idea of abolishing capitalism, which many people are not, we don't start from that place. We start from, what are you worried about? What makes you feel safe? What are your concerns about safety and violence? Maybe they're concerned, or, what are your concerns that lead you to believe that policing and prisons are the answer? And people's answers are different, and then it's going from there, not starting with this, we need to abolish racial capitalism, and people say, clutch their pearls, and then they back away from you and never talk to you again.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great point. I mean, I think it's about what questions you're asking, the answers you're looking for, or, you're hearing, and how to address them one by one, instead of looking at this, from this massive scale. And, there are a lot of opportunities to chip away. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with the 10 demands for justice, but it's a set of demands that I helped create earlier this year that, we collectively call, like, the road to abolition, because it's another misconception that, in addition to abolition meaning anarchy and lack of accountability, it also means getting rid of every cop and every cage overnight. And that's not feasible. If we were to do that, our system, our society isn't built yet to manage that. So things like getting rid of cash bail, qualified immunity, solitary confinement, for-profit policing, there are things that can happen, like, right away, getting cops out of schools, ending that school to prison pipeline that, we started this conversation with. There are things that can happen overnight as we're defunding police, that, help set us on this path. So, do you have any other kind of closing thoughts on that? What, the importance of having concrete demands, for mobilization, and, like, what, if any advice you might have for the 10 Demands organization as to like how to further the initiative, or any other person who is considering, reconsidering what they've always been taught about police and prisons, and how to move forward to help build these community-based systems.
Well, I think people who have not thought about this, or maybe are starting to think about this in the wake of COVID, George Floyd's murder, and the defund the police movements that have come up, and been given greater prominence, is, think about what your social circles and your community look like, whatever that community is, whether it's geographic or whether it's, more, like scattered, like, people might be in an academic community, or they might be in a, an artist community, and then think about who's in your immediate community. For people who live in urban areas that have buildings, do you know your neighbors? Get to know your neighbors. You don't need to have them over for dinner every Thursday. You don't have to be their best friends, but do you know your neighbors? Because if you know somebody, you're more likely to come to their aid than if you don't know them. I have lived in the same, I've been blessed to live in the same place for 2.5 decades, now that I think about it. And I know all of my neighbors. I know all of my neighbors in my building. I know several of my neighbors who are long-term neighbors on my block. Some of them, we don't know each other very well. There is one man that I've seen several years running. Every time we see him, this is our conversation. Hello, young lady, how are you? Oh, I'm fine, how are you? Oh, good, good. You keeping warm, or Merry Christmas, or whatever. And this is about the extent of our conversation. But the thing is, I know him, he knows me, and there's a greater likelihood that if something were to happen to either of us and the other one was around, we would come to each other's aid, rather than being like, I don't know that person, it's not my business. Like, so if I feel like I am being followed on the street, I could go to and I see him, I could go to him and be like, I think this man is following me, and, look to him for help, as opposed to like not knowing him at all, or having ignored him for several years and having him think that I am some stuck-up neighbor, and having him not, be willing to help me. Or maybe even somebody's following me and some big man says, hello, young lady, how are you doing today? And they're like, oh, you know what? She knows somebody here. I'm going to turn around and go elsewhere. It doesn't make that person not want to go harass Asian women that are walking by themselves, but it is a safety factor for me individually. So does it solve the greater issue of why some person is following somebody? No, but it does deter and prevent a possible attack. So getting to know your neighbors, and in the time of COVID, it is also good to know your neighbors, because what if, God forbid, somebody comes down with COVID and needs to quarantine, lives by themselves, and is like, I don't know any of my neighbors. So I guess I have to go out and get toilet paper and food and risk spreading COVID to everybody at the supermarket, versus maybe being able to text your neighbor and be like, if can you go and get me these things because I have to quarantine, and I'll Venmo, PayPal, or stick some money under your door for this, for these supplies. Thank you. So again, start small, figure out like who's in your community, and then build from there. Then maybe you can have conversations about like, oh, like, we don't really need more police, or like, what keeps us safe? Oh, do we need to call police on those kids having a barbecue over there that aren't social distancing and are kind of loud and annoying? Or, like, can we just be like, hey, can you be done by midnight so we can all go to sleep? So, but you don't start from, I don't know you and I want you not to call the police. You start from like, hi, how are you? And maybe, who are you? Which maybe one of these days I'll ask that man what his name is. But I
Very good. Awesome. Thank you so much, Vikki. I really appreciate your time.
Yes. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure.